Hello and welcome to C# Fundamentals with YJ.net. Now that we've learned about commands, repositories, and MVVM, that is model, view, view model, we're going to create a YJ application that showcases all of those concepts.
This is what the finished application will look like. So on the left over here we have our store, which is a data repeater, and you can see it has several items in it. If it had more items it would scroll, but we've only got 3 items. Over here we have the cart. So when items are added to the cart, they will show up here. This is a data grid view. And over here we have the checkout button. You can see it's grayed out because there's nothing in the cart. But when there's an item in the cart, you can click on the checkout button. So let me show you the basics of how this works. You can click on add to cart. The item is removed from the store and added to the cart. You get this little added to cart pop-up. And then you can click on checkout. It gives us our total, and you can click OK, and then the cart is cleared. So if I add 2 items to the cart and we click checkout, you can see our total is the sum of the prices. And that's the basics of how this app works. So let's go ahead and start building it. So I'm just going to go into Visual Studio, create a new project. We want a YJ.net web page application. So click Next. I'm going to call this Shopping App. And here's our blank YJ application. I'm going to go to page1.cs. We'll go ahead and add a new line there and save. There we go. I can open it in the designer now. I'm going to rename this though to page view. Click yes. So that'll name the designer file as well. Because remember, this code here as well as this code here is all part of our view. And we can also edit it in the designer. So if I double click here, I can open the designer and we can edit our UI. So again, remember the view is the UI layer. And so right now we are going to be creating the view. So let me go to Toolbox. We'll create our data repeater. And it's just called data repeater 1. I'll leave that. There are 2 ways you can create an item template in YJ. The first one is the easiest and the simplest, which is what we're going to do. We can drag and drop controls right here. The other way is that you can create a custom user control and then assign the item template property of the data repeater. But we're just going to drag and drop controls. Okay, so if you recall, there was a name, a price, a picture, and an add to cart button. So the name and price will be labels. The picture will be a picture box. And then the add to cart button will be a button. We'll change that text. And we'll go ahead and update these labels as well. So this will say label name. This will say label price. And let's go ahead and look at the properties of those. So for label name, for the name, we're going to call it label name. For label price, we will call it label price. And for the add to cart button, we will call it add to cart. Actually, we'll call it button add to cart. The picture box is just called picture box 1. We'll leave that as is. There's one thing I forgot about the picture box. we're going to do size mode zoom so that it looks nice. Let's add the data grid view. There we go. It's called data grid view. That's fine. Let's add the checkout button. Our text will say checkout. And we'll call it button checkout. And lastly, we just have two little labels just to make this a little bit clearer. So on the left, we have our store. And on the right, we have our cart. There we go. Okay, so that is our UI created. And as I said before, this is called the view in MVVM. As you will recall, MVVM stands for Model View View Model. We've just created the view. Let's go ahead and create the model. I'm going to add a new folder. And we'll call it model. Let's add a new C# class. And we'll call it product. And I'm just going to paste in some code here. So this is pretty simple. We can see it has the ID, name, image, and price. These are the 4 properties. And we can see here in the constructor, we're just taking in things and assigning them over here. You notice that image is underlined, so if I click on that, we can see we need using system.drawing, and now it all looks good. Okay, so we've got our model created. Let's go ahead and actually use our model and fill up our data repeater with some data, with some products. This code goes in the view model, but we're going to put it straight in the view at first, just so we can get it working, and then we'll move it to the view model to make it a little bit more correct. So let's go to the view. Again, I'm deliberately doing this wrong because it's simpler. And let's go ahead and add some code here. So I'm going to create a binding list of product called store stock list. And we're using a binding list so that the data binding gets updated automatically. If you add and remove items from a regular list, they won't be automatically added and removed in the UI. But if you have a binding list, they will be automatically added and removed in the UI. So that's why we're using a binding list over a list here. Let me go ahead and add a load event to my page. And let's paste some code within the load event. Okay, so again, image is being underlined. We need our using system.drawing. And then let's talk about what this code does. So store stock list equals new binding list product. So we're just creating our list here. Here we create an image. So we load an image from file, and then we do application.mapPath, and we do images/apple.png. Which reminds me, I need to go ahead and grab my images real quick. So here's our images. We just have apple.png, banana.jpg, orange.png. Pretty simple. Okay, then I add them to the list. So you can see here we have our ID, name, image, and price. ID, name, image, and price. And then I add the next 2. Let me change something here. My IDs should go up because I don't want them all to have the same ID of 1. So that's pretty good. And then I set the data repeater.data source to be store stock list. So this code looks decent. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we have 3 items in our data repeater, just like we should, but we don't see all of these fields populated. And that's because we didn't tell their data repeater how to do that, right? It doesn't know what's the name and the price and the picture box and the add to cart. So let's fix that real quick. Let me paste in some code here. And let's go over what this actually does. So first we have the part of the data repeater, right? Let's go ahead and into the view and look at our data repeater real quick. We have label name, label price, and picture box 1. Let's ignore the add to cart for now because that won't be binding to a specific part of the product model. Just the label name, label price, and picture box 1. And you'll see over here I have label name, label price, and picture box 1. Let's go ahead and look at the label name first, and then we'll talk about the other two. So we have label name.databindings.add, so we're adding a data binding, and then if I hover over here, you can see it says string property name, object data source, string data member. So string property name is the text. We are binding to the text of the label, which makes sense, right? We want to update the text. Object data source is our data source. Well, that's simply just the data source of the data repeater, which is why I have data repeater 1.dataSource. And data member is the part of the product, the part of the model. So let's go look at our model. You'll see we have ID, name, image, and price. Well, on the name text box, on label name, we want the string name to show up. So that's label name. Label price is pretty much the same thing, right? We're binding to the text property again. We're using data repeater 1.dataSource, but instead we're binding to the price property of the model. And that's why you see a different value on the price label. Finally, we have our picture box. You recall picture box shows an image. Well, we're binding to the image of the model. And if we look at our code, we'll see just that, right? We're binding to the image of the picture box. Again, we're using the data source of the data repeater. And we're using image, the image property of the product model. Okay, let's go ahead and add an item to the data grid view just to test things out. We'll delete this code in a bit because we don't want any items initially added to the data grid view, but I want to just make sure that everything is working correctly. So we're going to go ahead and create a list for our data grid view, which will be the cart list. And it's going to be a binding list of product. And let's go ahead and create a new image just so that I'm not reusing this Apple image over here. It's a new variable, although it is going to the same path as before. And I'm going to add it to the cart. So new product, we've got our ID, we have our name, we have our image, and we have our price. And then I'm just going to set the data source of the data grid view to be cart list. And let's go ahead and move that up here. So here we have our store stock list. Here we have our cart list. And here we have our data bindings. And there we go. We can see it in our cart. So that's all working correctly. Okay, let's talk about commands. If I go into my view, you can see this add to cart button. And we need to add a command so that whenever the button is clicked, the item is moved from the store into the cart. For now, we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to say that whenever it's clicked, we'll display an alert box that says added to cart, and we'll add the extra functionality later, just to get a simple command working and show you what that looks like. So let's go to our view. I'm going to create my command. There's my command, it says add to cart command. And let's go ahead and actually define that in our page view constructor. Here we go. So we have two methods here. They're both Lambda functions. And the first one is very simple. It'll show an alert box that says added to cart. This is the command that happens when it's executed. And the second one is our can execute method, which returns a boolean that indicates whether the command can be executed or not. In this case, we're just going to return true, so it can always be executed. We'll go ahead and update this later on to actually make it a little more complex. So next we need to actually bind this to the button, and that's pretty simple. Here we go. Button add to cart dot command, so we're binding to the command of the button, equals add to cart command. And let's go ahead and test this out. So here it says add to cart. I click on that. It says added to cart. Click on that, added to cart, added to cart. All right, so it's working. So right now we're loading all of our data in the view. This is incorrect for the MVVM structure. For MVVM, data is loaded in the repository. Usually your repository would connect to a database, especially in a larger project, but here we're just going to have a simple list to store the data. So let's go ahead and create a repository. As you will recall, the repository is part of the model, so I'm going to create my repository file in the model folder. I'll call it store repository. Okay, so in our repository there are two things. There is an interface, and then there is the actual repository, which is the implementation of the interface. So first, let me create my interface. And it's pretty simple. You can see we have a method for getting the products, a method for adding the product, and a method for removing the product. So let me go to my repository that implements iStore repository. And in my constructor, we're going to create our list. So there's the constructor. Let's go ahead and cut our code. There we go. Let's see, we have a few errors. So image, we need system.drawing, and then store stock list doesn't exist. So we're going to go ahead and create it right here. It's going to be read-only because we're not going to be able to edit it directly. You'll be forced to use the repository methods. And it's going to be a list because we're not actually binding directly to this list. The view model will load the list, and then the view model will bind to the view. So because there's no binding going on here, we don't need a binding list. Just a regular list is fine. Which also means that all of these need to say list. Let's see, what else? Application doesn't exist in the current context. So we need using ysg.web. And I'm going to grab these. So we have all our images up here. I'm going to replace this just to make it look a little bit nicer. You could do the code either way, but instead of the add command, now I'm just creating a new list that has those 3 products in it. You notice we've got the 1, 2, and 3. We've got our different IDs, apple, banana, and orange. Okay, so that's the basics created. You'll see we've got a little underline here. It's complaining that we haven't implemented get products, add product, and remove product. So let's go ahead and implement those real quick. Okay, so get products is pretty simple. We just return store stock list, right? We just return our list. To add a product, we just use the add method to add a product to the list. And then to remove a product, so it takes product ID. So first we go ahead and use that ID to get the product from the list. And then if the product is not null, meaning that we actually found a product for that ID, then we remove that product. Okay, so that is our store repository created. Okay, so now that we've created our store repository for our data repeater, we need to create a second repository, which we'll call cart repository, that corresponds to our data grid view, aka our shopping cart. It's going to look very similar to our store repository, so I'm just going to take our store repository code and copy it. We will create a new file. We'll call it cart repository. And we'll paste in this code. Okay, so instead of iStore repository, we want iCart repository. Instead of store repository, we want cart repository. We don't need all of this code to fill up our list because the cart will start out as being empty. And our list itself was called store stock list, but instead I'm going to rename it to cart list. There we go, that's been renamed. It's complaining about this here, so let's see what we need. We need using system.link, and that should be good. So we've got our cart repository set up. Now we're going to create our view model. You recall that it uses repositories to access the data. We also need to connect the view model to the view so that the data shows up in the view. So let me go ahead and add a new folder. We'll call it view model. And let's add a new file. We'll call it shopping view model. There we go. So we need references to our repositories. So let's add those in. You notice that the type is the interface, right? So any iStore repository this would take. I have currently an interface here and one implementation of that repository, but because it's based on the interface here, you could have any implementation of that repository. This is very handy for things like testing. You could have maybe a repository like this for testing where it just has a list, and then a repository that accesses a database for the actual application. Okay, so those are our references to our repositories. You notice they're private and read-only, right? We're not going to be using them directly outside of this model. We also need our lists. So we have a binding list of product for products and a binding list of product for cart. So these are just empty lists that we're going to fill later. Let's do a load method. So what this is here is we'll do products.clear. So we're going to clear our products. And actually, for good measure, let's go ahead and do cart.clear. There shouldn't be anything in our cart, but just in case. And then we'll go ahead and go through our repository and add the products to our product list here. So remember, we have two lists here. We have our, we'll call it sort of our database, right? Our data here, right? This is our data that's created in our repository. Perhaps in a more complex example would be an actual database. And then we also have our data here that's stored in our binding list products, right? This is the data that the UI is going to access. So keep in mind that we've got sort of two copies of that. And same thing with the cart, we've got two copies as well. So we're going through the repository, getting the products, and adding them to this binding list cart. Finally, we need a constructor, which I'll put up here. And so it takes the two repositories, and then it just assigns them to the variables store repository and cart repository. Okay, so that looks good. Let's go ahead and build real quick just in case. Yep, that builds. And let's go ahead and go into the view and actually implement this view model in the view. Okay, so now I'm in the view, pageview.cs. Let's go ahead and implement this view model. The first thing that I'm going to do is we're going to say using shopping app dot view model, so we have access to the code, right? Because it's in the view model folder, we've got the dot view model there after shopping app. And let's see, let's go ahead and create a reference to the view model. So private read only shopping view model, and we'll just call it view model. In the constructor, let's go ahead and initialize that. So view model equals new shopping view model. We're sending in a new store repository and a new cart repository, because as you will recall, the view model takes a store repository and a cart repository. So we're just creating new repositories. Next, we need to set the data source. So before we had the store stock list and this cart list, but now we're going to be using the list from the view model. So I can go ahead and delete these. And now you'll see data repeater 1.data source equals store stock list is causing an error because we need to set the list. So let's go ahead and move this into the constructor. And it's going to be view model dot, and we can see we've got cart and products. So our data repeater is the products. And then the data grid view is going to be view model dot cart. So I can delete this code here where I was adding items to the cart list. Remember, we were just testing out adding items to the data grid view there. I can delete this. And that should work. So let me save this and run it. And I'm not seeing anything in the store or in the cart. Because we're missing something. You will recall in the shopping view model, load is where we actually load everything from the repository from the quote database. So we need to call that. We'll just call it here. And there we go. We have our 3 items. And then if I click on add to cart, it says added to cart. So one thing about this added to cart command, you notice our command is being created here in the page. That is incorrect. We need to create our command in the view model. So let's do that next. So commands are created in the view model instead of the view because MVVM is designed to keep UI behavior separate from UI appearance. A command is something that happens. It's an action, which is behavior, so it belongs in the view model. And right now we have our add to cart command in the view. So let's go ahead and fix this up. So let me go to my view model. We will create a new command. We'll call it add to cart command. And let's go ahead and add something to our constructor over here. We need to actually create our command. So we'll say execute is add to cart, can execute is selected product is not null. I'll explain add to cart and selected product in a second here. So add to cart, let's go ahead and paste that in. For now, we'll just display an alert box, which is what we were doing before. Later on, we will fix that up so that it actually moves the item from the product's data repeater to the cart data grid view. Okay, so selected product. What is going on with selected product? Let me go ahead and paste in some code. So we have our private product selected product with the underscore, and then our public product selected product. So get, it just returns our private member. Set, it sets it to whatever value you have, and then it does add to cart command .raise can execute changed. So you'll recall that add to cart command can execute if selected product is not null. This makes sense. Think of our data repeater. And if you haven't selected an item from the data repeater, you can't add anything to the cart, right? Because we're going to use that selected item and add it to the cart. So selected item needs to be not null. Or sorry, rather selected product needs to be not null. And then raise can execute changed will just update can execute. So if selected product is set to null, it'll be set to false. If selected product is set to something that's not null, it'll be set to true. So let's go ahead and hook this up in the view. So if I go to my view, I can change this out here. So before I had my add to cart command. Let's delete that. Delete that. And button add to cart dot command equals view model dot add to cart command, which you will recall is just this add to cart command here. Okay, let's test it out. So they are all grayed out. I cannot add to cart. So something is wrong here. Let's go ahead and fix it. So the fix is pretty simple. It turns out that can execute is always false, and that's happening because selected product is null, which is happening because we never set selected product when the program started. So let's go ahead and set it in the load event handler here. And I'm just going to set it to products.firstOrDefault, which is a link method that returns the first element of a sequence or a default value if the sequence contains no elements. So let's go ahead and save that. You note also that we're using system.link up here. And let's go ahead and run it. And now add to cart is enabled. And if I select different items, it is still enabled. Okay, the next thing we need to do is actually change this add to cart functionality so that instead of displaying an alert box, it actually moves the item from the store into the cart. So one thing I want to note is that it's very common to see a view model that implements something called iNotify property changed. And in our case, we're not implementing it because we don't need it, but I wanted to explain what it does. So iNotify property change is commonly implemented in view models so that the UI knows when a property value changes and can automatically update what's displayed. If we had something maybe like a cart total label, we could use iNotify property change to update it whenever the total changes. The thing about our project is that our data, which is products and cart, are stored in binding lists. The binding list takes care of updating the UI whenever its value changes. So in this particular small project, we don't need to implement iNotify property changed. But I wanted to mention that so you know that it is a common pattern that's used in MVVM. Okay, so I'm in the view and we need to update selected product, that is viewModel.selectedProduct, so that it corresponds to whatever item is selected within the data repeater. So let me go to my designer and I'm going to go to my data repeater. There is an event we need to attach to called current item index changed. There it is, current item index changed. Let's double click. And now we've attached the event. Let me go ahead and paste in some code. Okay, so in current item index changed, we have access to the current item index of the data repeater. So we're just going to save that in a variable. And we'll check and make sure it is greater than or equal to 0 and that it is less than viewModel.products.count. And if that's true, which it should be, then viewModel.selectedProduct equals viewModel.productsIndex. So we're going to use the index to get the item out of viewModel.products, which you will recall viewModel.products is our binding list. Okay. Okay, so I'm in shopping view model right now, and we need to update add to cart. So this is our add to cart method, which, as you will recall, is executed whenever the add to cart command is executed, which happens whenever the user clicks on the add to cart button. So currently it's just showing an alert box. What we need to do is move the selected product from products into cart, right? From the data repeater into the data grid view. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to check to see if it's null, right? So selected product is null, we'll return. Next we'll go ahead and get our selected product. So we'll store it in a variable product to move. And then we need to go ahead and update the repositories, right? Our databases, essentially. So we will remove it from the store and add it to the cart. And you will recall remove product takes an ID, so it's just product to move.id. Add product just takes a product object, so we can just send the product directly. So this is great. We're updating the databases. However, we also need to update the UI. And as you will recall, products and cart are bound to the UI. So I can just do this. Products.remove, product to move, cart.add, product to move. Okay, let's go ahead and test this out. So add to cart, we've added our banana to cart. Add to cart, we've added our orange to cart. Add to cart, we've added another orange. So we have a bug here that we need to fix. Okay, so our bug is that sometimes when you click on the row's Add to Cart button, the command gets executed before a selected product has been updated to that row. So after moving orange, clicking banana could still run the command against the stale orange selection. So what we need to do is make sure that selected product is updated accordingly. So let's go ahead and add some code. Let's go to our view. I'm going to add something here to our data repeater. We're going to attach to the item cloned event. Here we go, item cloned. And this is fired whenever a new item is created in the data repeater. Let me go ahead and paste in some code. Little comment there. There we go. Okay. So we're going to check that button add to cart is a button, right? So e.datarepeater-item.controls button add to cart is a button, just to make sure that everything is fine. And then if it is a button, it has a click event, so we're going to add a method. So update selected parent. Note that we actually remove and then attach it. This is just to make sure it's only attached once. If we were to just attach it, and then for some reason this code was called again, it would get attached again, and then the update selected product would run twice. We don't want that. Okay, so let's grab our updated selected product code. Okay, so updated selected product. It has object sender event args e because it is a event handler, right? It's attached to the button click event. And we're going to go ahead and check the sender, which is whoever called this method, is a WiseJ control with a data repeater parent, right? So if the sender is not a control or the parent is not data repeater item, then return. So once we get through this, we know that our sender is a WiseJ control and that its parent is a data repeater item. So now that we know that, we can go ahead and update selected product in the view model based on the selected item index in the data repeater. So we get our index, which is just item to item index. We check to make sure it's valid, right? It's greater than or equal to 0, and it's less than the products.count. And if that's true, then viewModel.selectedProduct equals our viewModel.products index, right? We essentially get our item out of the products list and set it equal to selected product. Else, so if that didn't work, then selected product is null. So let's go ahead and save this and test it out. And add to cart, add to cart, add to cart. So that is all working correctly now. So currently, whenever I click on the checkout button, nothing happens, even if I have items in my cart. Let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to go to Shopping View Model, and let's add a new command. Right, we have our Add to Cart command. Let's go ahead and add our Checkout command. We create our Add to Cart command here, In the constructor, let's go ahead and create our checkout command here in the constructor. So execute, it will call the checkout method, and can execute cart repository.getProducts.count is greater than 0. Right? You can only check out if you have at least one product in the cart. All right, so let's add the checkout method. And it's pretty simple. We have our total, and we're going to show a message box that says our total. Later on, we will actually update this total so that we are calculating the total of all the products in the cart. So let's go to our view, and here we have button add to cart.command. Let's go ahead and set our button checkout here. Button checkout.command. So it's viewModel.checkout command. And let's go ahead and run this. So if I click add to cart, it's added to cart. And you notice this is still grayed out. So we need to make sure that this is updating appropriately. So I'm in the shopping view model file, and looking at the load method here, I'm going to add a line of code. Checkout command.raise can execute changed. So what does this do? So it forces the UI to reevaluate a command's can execute logic. So controls bound to that command can automatically enable or disable themselves based on the current application state. So in our case, we have a button bound to the checkout command, and our checkout button can become enabled or disabled appropriately. So when the application is first loaded, we'll raise can execute change, so that button will check if it should be disabled or enabled based on can execute, so based on if there are any items in the cart repository. And we also need to call it an add to cart, right? Because whenever we add an item to the cart, that affects whether there are, well, items in the cart, which affects the can execute method, which affects whether our button should be enabled or disabled. So now that we have that code in, let's go ahead and run it. And I click add to cart. Checkout is now enabled. And I can click on my button and it gives my total. So the last thing I need to do is the logic for this value so that it actually gives a total based on the items in the cart instead of just always saying 5. Okay, so let's update this so that it actually shows the correct value in the message box on checkout instead of just always showing 5. So it needs to be a decimal total because if the prices are all decimals, and we can just do cart.sum and sum all of the prices and then say your total is plus the total. So let me delete this here. And let's go ahead and run that. So add to cart, there's our banana. Check out, your total is 40 cents. And add to cart, check out, your total is 320. So one problem is whenever I check out, this cart should be cleared, and it's not getting cleared. So let's go ahead and fix that. So in the checkout method, we will empty the cart, and we actually need to empty it twice. So we need to empty it in the UI, which is cart.clear, and we need to empty it in the repository or the database. And we need actually a method in order to clear the repository. So I'm going to call that clear products. And let's go into the cart repository and add that. So we need to update our interface. So I'll just say void clear products. And now you see this is complaining because the repository that implements the interface doesn't have a clear products method. So let's just quickly add that in. There we go. And let's run our application. So add to cart, check out. Your total is $239, and it clears the cart. And then I can add to cart and check out again, and it clears the cart. Okay, so that was an introduction to commands, repositories, and MVVM in a WiseJ sample application. I hope you enjoyed. Bye!